1584. A notary in Toledo writes something in a leather-bound ledger that shouldn't exist. Subject's pupils 4 millimeters at rest. 6 millimeters when presented with the host. Insufficient dilation. Flag for secondary observation. He's measuring a woman's eyes during communion. Recording the diameter of her pupils when she looks at the cross. Not for medicine, for evidence. Her name was Isabel d'Orta. She was 33. And in 18 months, men would cite the size of her pupils as proof she should burn. But here's what doesn't make sense. By 1584, this wasn't new. The Inquisition had been measuring women's bodies for over a century. Pulse rates, tear production, how many times they blinked during prayer. They had entire manuals dedicated to what a woman's flesh would reveal when her words wouldn't. What were they actually looking for? And why did they need 300 pages of instructions to find it? If you've ever wondered what institutions do when they stop looking for truth and start manufacturing it, you're in the right place. This is Crimson Historians. We find the documents they buried. Hit subscribe because what happened to Isabel? It happened to 60,000 other women. And the method they used didn't die in Spain. Spain, 1478. The Inquisition begins. Most people think they know this story. Religious extremists hunting heretics. Jews forced to convert. The accused tortured until they confess. Flames screaming. The rack. That's not wrong, but it's not complete. Because here's what the numbers show. Between 1480 and 1530, the Inquisition executed about 2,000 people. Terrible, documented, but in the same period, they interrogated over 40,000. And of those 40,000, roughly 23,000 were released without execution. So what were they doing with the other 21,000 hours? The answer is in the archives in Valladolid, in Seville, in repositories across Spain, where researchers are still finding ledgers that most people will never see. These aren't confession transcripts. They're observation logs. Subject perspired when asked about the Sabbath. Subject's hands remained dry when touching the crucifix. Subject failed to produce tears during passion recitation. Observed 3 consecutive times. Page after page, woman after woman, pulse, pupils, perspiration, tears, trembling. The Inquisition wasn't just prosecuting heresy. They were building a catalog of how the body betrays what the mind conceals. And they had one population they practiced this on more than any other. By 1540, nearly 58% of those brought before tribunals were women. Not because women were committing more heresy, but because the Inquisition believed women's bodies would reveal it more clearly. Why women? What did they think the female body would show that men's wouldn't? Isabel's door opens on a Tuesday, September 1589. 2 men, familiarists, Inquisition officers. They don't shout, don't break anything. One of them shows her a rolled parchment with a wax seal. She's not told what she's accused of. That comes later. First, she's taken to what they call the audiencia chamber. Not a dungeon, not a torture room, a chamber that looks almost bureaucratic. A table, 3 chairs, a crucifix on the wall. A window with iron bars, but sunlight still filters through. The ordinariness is deliberate. Because here's what's in the Inquisition training manuals. Yes, they had training manuals written by Tomás de Torquemada himself in 1484 and revised 6 times by 1570. Here's what they say about the first 72 hours. The accused who enters in terror will confess to anything. The accused who enters in composure will reveal everything. They didn't want panic. They wanted observation because terrified people are useless for what they're actually trying to do. Isabel sits in that room for 6 hours before anyone speaks to her. Just sits with 2 notaries watching from behind a wooden screen. They're not writing her confession. She hasn't said anything. They're writing descriptions. Subject shifts position every 11 minutes. Subject touches face 4 times in first hour. Subject's breathing rate increases when footsteps approach door. They're not interrogating her. They're cataloging her. And here's the detail that reframes everything. Isabel doesn't know it yet, but she's already failed 3 tests. Not tests of faith, tests of biology. Let's pause Isabel's story for a moment, because to understand what happens to her, you need to understand what the Inquisition actually believed about the human body. In 1487, 9 years after the Inquisition's founding, 2 inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, published a book, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. Most people know it as a witch-hunting manual. It is, but buried in Part 2, Question 1, Article 6, there's a section called Whether Witches Can Habitate the Power of Generation and Obstruct the Venereal Act. Translation: Whether a person's body, when touched by evil, would physically respond differently than a pure body. The Inquisitors took this idea and ran with it. They theorized, wrongly but consistently, that conversion to Christianity wasn't just spiritual. It was physiological. That when someone genuinely accepted Christ, their nervous system would change. Their tears would come easier during Mass. Their pulse would quicken before the Eucharist. Their pupils would dilate at the sight of the Virgin. And if those responses didn't happen, the body was remembering something else. By 1520, there were Inquisition physicians, not to heal but to measure. They had instruments, calipers for measuring pupil dilation, water clocks for timing pulse rates, graduated vials for collecting and measuring tears. In Seville in 1537, a tribunal spent 4 months testing this theory. They brought in 50 confirmed conversos, Jews who'd converted to Christianity, and 50 old Christians, people whose families had been Catholic for generations. Then they ran both groups through identical religious exercises while measuring their physical responses. The results, still in the archive, showed no consistent difference. None. The conversos cried, didn't cry, trembled, stayed calm, dilated, constricted in the exact same random patterns as the old Christians. One of the inquisitors, Francisco Pena, wrote in the margin, "The flesh does not differentiate what the soul contains. Our instruments detect nothing." And then he wrote one more sentence. "Continue observations. Expand sample size." They knew their method didn't work. By 1537, they used it for another 150 years. That's not ignorance. That's something else. Back to that room in Toledo. It's now been 18 hours since Isabel's arrest. She hasn't slept, hasn't eaten anything but bread and water. The window behind her shows it's night now. Finally, an inquisitor enters. His name is in the records, Alonso de Mendoza. He's 58. He's been doing this for 22 years. He carries a wooden case about the size of a prayer book. He doesn't sit across from Isabel. He sits beside her, close enough that she can smell the ink on his clothes. The questions start, but they're not about Judaism. Not at first. Describe your wedding night. Isabel blinks, hesitates. She's been married 14 years. She has a daughter. What does this have to do with heresy? Mendoza opens the wooden case. Inside, a glass vial, a thin brass rod with millimeter markings, a small mirror. I asked you to describe your wedding night. Did you feel joy? She answers. Yes, of course. Did you weep? No. Should she have? Mendoza makes a note. Then he asks her about her daughter's birth, whether she prayed during labor, which saint she invoked, whether she felt ecstasy, his word ecstasy, when the child first breathed. Isabel is trying to figure out the right answer. But there isn't one, because he's not listening to her words. He's watching her carotid artery. The notary behind the screen is timing her pulse with a water clock, counting how many beats pass in the time it takes for water to drip from one chamber to another. Then Mendoza does something that appears in dozens of Inquisition transcripts, but is almost never discussed in history books. He takes out the mirror, holds it 6 inches from Isabel's face, and asks her to look at the crucifix on the wall while he watches her reflection. What is he looking at? Her pupils. In the records, there's a notation. Subject's pupils constricted when viewing crucifix. Expected dilation absent. Inconsistent with documented response of genuine converts. Expected by whom? Based on what? There's no citation, no reference, just an assertion that Isabel's eyes should have responded differently. But here's the detail that makes this worse. Isabel knows what he's doing because by 1589, everyone knows. Converso families have been teaching their daughters for 2 generations how to perform the right physical responses. Cry when you take communion. Let your hands shake when you kiss the cross. Practice dilating your pupils by looking at candlelight before bed. Isabel has practiced. She's 43 years old, and she spent 20 of those years making her body lie. And it's still not enough. After 22 hours of interrogation, Isabel is taken to a cell. Not a dungeon, not yet. A room 10 foot x 12 feet, 1 candle, a straw mattress, a bucket, and a cellmate. Her name, according to the records, is Maria Enriquez. She's 51. She tells Isabel she's been here for 3 weeks, accused of reading prohibited books. She seems kind, exhausted, sympathetic. She's lying. This is in the Inquisition manuals, too. There's a section titled Detestibus Occultist on hidden witnesses. When observation alone fails to produce evidence, place a cooperative witness in the cell. Instruct her to befriend the accused. Record all conversations. Promise leniency in exchange for testimony. They called these women auras, ears, former accused who traded information for freedom. Sometimes they were genuine prisoners who'd agreed to inform. Sometimes they were Inquisition employees who'd never been accused at all, just trained to play the role. Maria asks Isabel gentle questions. What was your life like before this? Do you have children? Are you afraid? Isabel, alone and terrified and desperate for human connection, talks. She talks about her daughter, about her husband who died 2 years ago, about how she lights candles on Friday. Not for the Sabbath, she insists, because Friday is when she cleans the house. Behind the wall, a notary writes it all down. 3 days later, Isabel will be confronted with a transcript of everything she said to Maria, including things she doesn't remember saying, including things she definitely didn't say, but can't prove she didn't. Because who's going to believe her over a written record? But here's where the method becomes something worse than entrapment. Because Maria doesn't just ask questions, she performs. At night, when the candle burns low, Maria prays loudly with trembling hands and tears streaming down her face. She clutches the wooden rosary they've allowed her to keep. And she weeps, genuinely weeps, while reciting the Pater Noster. Isabel watches, and she knows she has to know what's happening. This is a demonstration. This is what genuine Christian devotion is supposed to look like. This is the standard her own body is being measured against. So Isabel tries. She prays, she cries, she makes her hands shake. But the notary records, subject's tears inconsistent, ceased abruptly when cellmate stopped praying. Physiological response suggests performance rather than genuine devotion. They're not just spying on her words, they're grading her grief. On the seventh day, Isabel confesses. She admits to lighting candles on Friday, to avoiding pork, to teaching her daughter a Hebrew blessing she learned from her grandmother, to keeping a small cloth with Hebrew letters sewn into the hem hidden in a trunk. The inquisitors listen, record everything, ask follow-up questions. How many Fridays? Which specific prayers? Where did she get the cloth? Isabel answers it all. She's weeping now, genuinely weeping, because she thinks this is over. She thinks confession means she'll be reconciled. Forced to do public penance? Yes. Made to wear the sanbenito, the yellow garment that marks penitence? Yes. But alive, home with her daughter. Mendoza closes the ledger, thanks her, tells her she'll be moved to a different cell while they prepare her reconciliation ceremony. Isabel is escorted out. The door closes. And then Mendoza writes something that appears in thousands of Inquisition files. A single sentence that determines whether someone lives or dies. Subject's confession exhibits physiological inconsistency. What does that mean? It means Isabel confessed wrong. Not that she confessed to the wrong things, but that her body, while confessing, didn't display the right responses. There's a manual entry on this, written in 1552 by Inquisitor General Fernando de Valdez. The truly repentant show specific signs: copious tears, trembling that begins in the hands and spreads to the torso, difficulty breathing, faintness when contemplating the magnitude of sin. Those who confess from calculation rather than genuine remorse will display muted or controlled responses. These must be observed for extended periods. They had a checklist for grief. Isabel cried, but not copiously enough. She trembled, but it didn't spread from her hands to her torso. She didn't faint when contemplating her sins. Therefore, not genuinely repentant, therefore still a secret Jew, therefore eligible for execution. And the most horrifying detail? Isabel almost certainly knew this because by 1589, this wasn't secret. Families warned each other. Practice your confession. Make it physical. Hyperventilate if you have to, fall to the floor. Make them believe your body is collapsing under the weight of your sins. But there's a problem with that strategy. A problem the Inquisition had anticipated. If you perform collapse too well, they know you're performing. The notary writes, subject's physical distress appeared excessive and rehearsed. Too little grief, guilty. Too much grief, guilty. The right amount of grief, a moving target that changed with every tribunal, every inquisitor, every notary's personal judgment of what authentic suffering looked like. You couldn't win. The system was designed so you couldn't win. Here's where the story should end. Isabel Burns, another victim of religious extremism. We move on. But in 1998, a researcher named Carmen Hernandez found something. She was working in the archive of the Royal Chancery of Valladolid, examining Inquisition trial records for her dissertation. Routine work. But she noticed something in the margins of a 1623 procedural manual. Handwritten notes, not official entries. Personal annotations made by inquisitors themselves. One note next to a section on physiological observation techniques. Garcia observed 20 subjects under identical conditions. No correlation between pupil dilation and confession validity. Method unreliable. Another note, dated 1631, tested tear measurement protocols. Old Christians and conversos show identical range of responses. Physiological detection cannot distinguish belief. And then, dated 1642, where method lacks foundation. Continue use pending alternative procedure. They knew by 1623. They knew their science of body reading didn't work. And they didn't just continue using it, they expanded it. Between 1640 and 1680, the number of physiological observation tools documented in Inquisition inventories actually increased. More mirrors, more calipers, more water clocks, more detailed instruction manuals on what measurements to take and how to interpret them. Hernandez found tribunal records from 1655, 32 years after inquisitors had privately acknowledged the method was worthless, where women were still being convicted based on insufficient tear production, inadequate pupil dilation, and controlled breathing inconsistent with genuine remorse. Why? If they knew it didn't work, why keep doing it? The answer is in another margin note. This one from 1638, written by Inquisitor Juan Dino Valdez. The method's value lies not in accuracy of detection, but in efficacy of control. When subjects believe their bodies can betray them, they police themselves. This is preferable to forced compliance. Read that again. The point wasn't to find secret Jews. The point was to make people so afraid of their own nervous systems that they'd regulate themselves. Make your own flesh the enemy. Make authentic emotion impossible because every tear, every tremor might be evidence against you. And it worked. For generations, Converso families didn't just hide their religious practices. They taught their children to control their physiological responses, to never cry too much or too little, to calibrate their trembling, to suspect their own biology. The Inquisition didn't need to watch everyone all the time. They just needed everyone to believe they were being watched, and to believe that their bodies would give them away. Isabel Dorda was executed on March 15, 1591, not in secret, but in public in Toledo's Plaza de Zocodover, in front of a crowd estimated at 4,000 people. The ceremony took 6 hours. First, the procession. Isabel and 14 other condemned, 11 women, 3 men, walked from the Inquisition prison to the plaza wearing San Benito painted with flames and devils. Their crimes were read aloud. Isabel's list: lighting candles on the Jewish Sabbath, refusing pork, teaching Hebraic prayers to her daughter. Confession lacking physiological consistency with genuine repentance. Body failing to display adequate signs of divine grace. That last line, that's what killed her. Not the candles, not the prayers. The fact that her pupils didn't dilate correctly. The fact that her tears didn't flow copiously enough. The fact that her hands trembled, but the trembling didn't spread to her torso. Her body failed the test, so her body burned. The execution method, relaxatio ad armam. Legal language meaning the church hands you to civil authorities who will kill you because the church technically doesn't execute anyone. They tied her to a wooden stake, piled wood around her feet. There's a detail in the record that most summaries omit. They offered her a chance, even at this moment, to reconcile. If she confessed, genuinely confessed with the right physiological responses, they would gar her first before lighting the fire. A mercy killing. Isabel confessed again, said everything they wanted to hear. But the notary watching her, there was a notary even at the execution. Recorded, subject's confession delivered without adequate trembling. Voice remained steady, eyes dry. They didn't gar her. They burned her conscious. Her daughter, Anna, was in the crowd. 9 years old, required by law to attend her mother's execution. And here's the detail that makes this unbearable. Anna's testimony still exists. Given 20 years later when she herself was accused, she describes watching her mother burn, and she describes what she learned. I learned that no truth could save her, that her words meant nothing if her body spoke differently. I learned that I must teach my own body to lie more perfectly than she did. I learned that surviving meant becoming a stranger to my own flesh. Anna lived because she learned the lesson. She practiced fainting during confession, practiced weeping on command, practiced trembling that started in her hands and spread to her shoulders, her chest, her legs. She survived by becoming what the Inquisition demanded. A woman whose body was an unreadable performance, whose every physiological response was calculated, whose authentic self was buried so deep that even she couldn't find it. The Spanish Inquisition officially ended in 1834, but the method didn't die. 1692, Salem witch trials. Women ducked in water to see if they'd sink or float. They searched for witches' marks, areas of skin that wouldn't bleed when pricked. Observed for signs that their bodies had been altered by demonic influence. Same logic. The guilty body will reveal itself. The flesh doesn't lie. 1933 to 1945, Nazi racial scientists measuring skull dimensions, eye color, nose shape, trying to build physiological profiles of Jewish features that could be detected even in converts to Christianity. Same logic. Ancestry lives in biology. The body remembers what the person tries to hide. 1950s to 1960s, polygraph tests in American criminal justice. Measuring heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, skin conductivity, trying to detect deception through physiological response. Same logic. The body will betray what the mind conceals. Each iteration claims to be scientific. Each iteration accumulates data. Each iteration documents patterns. And each iteration ends up targeting whoever the institution wants to control. The Inquisition's obsession with women's physiological responses wasn't an aberration. It was a prototype, a method that discovered something. You don't need to prove someone is guilty. You just need to create a system where innocence can't be proven, where the body itself becomes evidence of its own corruption. Isabel de Cordoba's file, case number 4732, in the Toledo Diocesan Archive, sits in a climate-controlled room in Spain. Researchers need permission to access it. Most never do. Inside, 47 pages. Observations of her pulse, her pupils, her tears, her trembling, transcripts of her conversations with Maria, the ear, records of her confessions, first, second, third, fourth, notations on the inadequacy of her physiological responses, and on the final page in careful script, relax to the secular arm. March 15, 1591, age 34. Execution confirmed. No further observation necessary. No further observation necessary because there was nothing left to observe. The Spanish mystic Teresa of Avila wrote something in 1577. She knew the Inquisition was watching her. She'd been investigated herself. Her writings examined for heresy. She wrote, "I am more afraid of those who are so afraid of the devil than I am of the devil himself." She understood. The danger isn't the punishment. It's the performance required to avoid it. The exhaustion of making your own body testify to things you may or may not believe. The loneliness of being permanently suspected by your own flesh. That's what they did to Isabel, to Anna, to 60,000 others whose names fill ledgers across Spain. They didn't just kill bodies. They killed the possibility of authentic existence. Made every emotion suspect, every tear a test, every tremor evidence. The body doesn't lie, they said, but they proved the opposite. They proved you can torture someone not with blades, but with the demand that their flesh confess what their mind refuses. If this story made you understand something about how power operates when it stops looking for truth and starts manufacturing compliance, subscribe to Crimson Historians. We find the documents they buried. We resurrect the voices they tried to silence. Because the moment we forget how this was done to Isabel, how an institution spent 3 centuries perfecting the science of turning bodies into testimony, that's the moment someone tries it again. Our next investigation. What English witchfinders discovered when they threw women into water and watched whether they'd sink or swim, and what that taught them about using physics as proof of guilt.